Hello, everyone. I'm Keith Stone, your host for the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series, a production of the Harvard University Center for Atlantic Studies. And I'm very happy to welcome back with us today as our guest, Casey Dewey, who is Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Houston. And just briefly, her interests for teaching and research include ancient Greek oral traditions, Homeric poetry, Greek tragedy, and textual criticism. And I guess it's about the last one of these that you'll be talking with us today, Casey. You're going to be talking about your new book, just out, Achilles Unbound. And I suspect that unbound in this case means unbound from textual fixity, perhaps. So welcome back. Thanks for joining us, and can't wait to hear about your book.
Thank you very much. So yeah, what I thought I would do for today, since many of the people here have probably heard me talk about sort of my research in general, on the multiformity of the oral tradition in which the Iliad and Odyssey were created. I thought I would pick a particular aspect, a particular chapter from my new book, Achilles Unbound, and go into that. The book, which Keith mentioned, was recently published. It's meant to be kind of a manifesto of sorts, for the Homer Multitext project. This is a project I've spoken about with you guys before. And it's fairly traditional in the past few hundred years of textual criticism. When somebody makes an edition of an ancient work, they usually publish either a book to go with it or a very long introduction, usually in Latin, explaining kind of like their editorial choices, and why they did what they did. But this is meant to replace that, to do something a bit different from that. But the aim is kind of the same, which is to provide a rationale. Why did we even want to have a Homer multitext? And the book gathers together writing that I've done over the past 20 years about the multiformity of the epic tradition. So some of it may be familiar if you've ever read anything I've written, but everything has been revised for its present place. So with that background, I can say that in terms of why we would want to make a multitextual edition of the Iliad, my focus for today is going to be the fragments of the Iliad that survive on papyrus. These are some of our oldest witnesses. They go back to the 3rd century BC. So if normally, like I say, in the traditional practice of textual criticism, you try to get back to your oldest witnesses, right? Because if you go back to your oldest witnesses, you're at least, that much further back, closer to the time of composition. But it's funny, for the Iliad, people tend to dismiss our oldest witnesses, these fragments on papyrus. And you'll see why today, because they're different from what we expect. They have a different kind of text very often than what you find in medieval manuscripts. So that is scary for people. People don't like to see that. And I guess I'm trying to say, why not embrace it? Why not look at everything? Why wouldn't we want to look at everything? Because it just gives us even more evidence for how this traditional system worked. Okay, so I'm going to start with the very end of the Iliad, the last line of the Iliad. And the medieval manuscripts and all modern editions, including Monroe and Allen's 1920 Oxford Classical text, they end the same way. And this will be on the slide, the first slide, if you could show that. This is at verse 804 of book 24 of the Iliad. And they all end with, thus they celebrated the burial of Hector, tamer of horses. But we have this interesting note in the Scholia. And actually, before I get there, though, let me say that I do think that this is a very deeply meaningful ending that brings closure to the story of the Iliad, this the burial of Hector, tamer of horses. Like I say, it brings closure to the story of the Iliad. It, at the same time, really powerfully looks ahead to the death and lamentation and funeral for the Iliad's central figure, Achilles, because we know that the death of Hector means the death of Achilles. At least they're very interconnected. This has been prophesied by numerous characters throughout the epic. So we know the death of Achilles is coming. And so it's a very powerful note to end on. Thetis says in book 18, she says that Achilles' death is going to come straight away after Hector, and that the two are inextricably linked. And yet it seems that not every Iliad ended in this same way. Because like I was just saying before, and there's this note in the Scholia of an 11th century manuscript, the one that we call the Townley manuscript. And the note says, some write, and of course this is going back to ancient scholarship, these Scholia go back to ancient scholarship on the Iliad. And it says, some write, thus they celebrated the burial of Hector, and then an Amazon came, the daughter of great-hearted man-slaying Ares. So we might be tempted to dismiss this comment because all of a sudden, I mean, where's this Amazon coming from? What are we doing?
And this is the end of the Iliad, right? This isn't just like a continuation. This is how it really ends. That's such a cliffhanger.
Exactly. Yeah, it comes out of nowhere in some ways, right? And if you're familiar at all with the poems of the epic cycle and the one known as the Aethiopis, these other epic poems that were circulating in antiquity alongside the Iliad and the Odyssey, you might think this is somebody's confused here. They've taken this from the Aethiopis, we know that by the time the poems of the epic cycle came to be summarized by the ancient scholar Proclus, that's the primary way we know them now. We know they've been kind of fit around the Iliad and Odyssey. At least that's how presents them, and they kind of flow relatively seamlessly from one to the next. And so in the summary of Proclus, this is the initial episode of the Aethiopis. So I think this would probably be on the next slide. We could go to that.
When you said, Casey, about them flowing seamlessly together, there was a bit of a break in the audio.
This is, I was saying that that Proclus describes the initial episode of the Aethiopis this way, and I was going to say we should go to the next slide.
Okay, perfect.
So this is how he describes it. He says, the Amazon Penthesilea comes to Troy as an ally of the Trojans. She's the daughter of Ares and Thracian by birth. In the middle of her Aristeia, Achilles kills her, and the Trojans bury her. Achilles slays Thersites after having been reviled by him and reproached for his alleged love for Penthesilea. So if we can trust Proclus, the Aethiopis began with the arrival of Penthesilea. So we might ask, could this attested multiform on papyrus, in the Townley manuscript, could that really be a verse from the Aethiopis that's like somehow been wrongly added to the Iliad? And if that were our only evidence, just that comment in the Townley, we might be tempted to think that. But there's a similar variation on the end of the Iliad that is attested on a 1st century CE papyrus. That's papyrus 104, and it's on the same slide as well. So we see, thus they celebrated the burial of Hector, and then an Amazon came, the daughter of Otrera, beautiful Penthesilea. So not exactly the same as we had before, but perfectly like language on a similar idea that brings an Amazon onto the scene. I can't resist showing you the base painting, by the way, that is on the next slide. So we should look at it. It is signed by Ezekias. It's a black figure vase that shows Achilles killing the Amazon Penthesilea. And my mentor and professor from back in the day, Greg Naj, director of the CHS, always taught us about this phase, showing us how with Achilles and Penthesilea looking at each other in the eye and falling in love at that moment that Achilles kills Penthesilea. So we know that this was an epic story that was being, composed and performed just as the Iliad and Odyssey were being. And so a plausible explanation is that even as late as the 1st century CE, the division between the Iliad and the Aethiopis wasn't so cut and dried. It could certainly be the case that the Aethiopis, maybe began before the traditional end of our Iliad, and then that the Iliad and the Aethiopis tradition overlapped in content. Also, the Iliad may have extended further in more fluid phases of the epic tradition. So we can't feel like we know exactly when every poem started and stopped, because that's just not how this tradition worked, at least in the very early phases of it. And so it seems from this evidence that I've been talking about that even after the poem had crystallized into the shape in which we now know it, it's quite possible that in non-regulated contexts, a versatile singer with a broad repertoire could have, just picked up and left off wherever he saw fit, as the time, the occasion, and the audience response guided him. So it's really only highly regulated festival context that would have required a particular ending to the Iliad, I think. And even if what we know from the medieval manuscripts as verse 24:804 was the usual way to end the Iliad, there was nothing to stop a skilled singer from continuing the story if he and his audience desired that, right? So there's nothing to say in any given performance of epic poetry where you had to start and stop. And the Odyssey gives us a glimpse of this flexibility, right? Well, you probably remember the opening verses, the opening invocation of the Muse in the Odyssey, where the poet asks the Muse to tell the story of Odysseus' wandering, says starting from whatever point you choose, right? And then in Odyssey 8, the Muse inspires the singer Demodocus to pick up a story thread. In other words, Demodocus, inspired by the Muse, dips into the epic tradition and pulls out from among the many tales he could tell the story of the quarrel of Agamemnon and Odysseus. And where you start and stop in a tradition like this is significant, because there's more than one place to do it, right? There's more than one place to start and stop. So it changes the story. It changes the nature of the performance depending on where you start and stop. So the introduction of Penthesilea into a story that's now has been up to now about the consequences of Achilles' wrath, which was provoked by his grief over the taking of Briseis, that changes the arc of the poem, considerably. But just because we prize the thematic closure that Iliad 24 brings doesn't mean that the poem always had to be performed that way. The addition of Penthesilea to a poem, or to this poem, would bring, it would bring to the fore a theme associated with Achilles that for the most part is not emphasized in our Iliad. And that's his erotic associations with a wide variety of female characters beyond Briseis. They include Deidamia on Skyros, various women of the towns that he sacked throughout the Troad, Polyxena, and even Helen in some traditions. So this is a theme that I explored in my 2002 book about Briseis, where I suggested on the basis of surviving tales about Achilles in a variety of sources that there were local Aeolic epic traditions in which Achilles has a love interest who helps him storm towns like Pedasos and Methamnon, possibly other towns as well. You remember him talking about the 11 cities that he sacked and all of these things. Now the Iliad would be likely to screen out such an erotic narrative, but it doesn't do it entirely. At least that's what I've argued. In book 1 of the Iliad, Briseis leaves Achilles unwillingly. That's really our main insight into her character in that book until her lament in Iliad 19. We don't know much about her, but it says she left Achilles unwillingly. And in Iliad 9, Achilles proclaims that he loves her as a man loves his wife, even though he won her with the spear. And her lament for Patroclus in Iliad 19, we learn about her hope to become Achilles' courtier à la coste, his bride, his youth in Phthia. So like I say, the Iliad that we know mostly omits these kinds of erotic narratives. They seem to have been more prevalent in the poems of the epic cycle, and maybe that's because of the Iliad's focus on Achilles' wrath in connection with Agamemnon's seizure of Briseis and then his subsequent grief for Patroclus. So maybe there's just not room for them in our Iliad. You know, the themes of the Iliad center around Achilles' meanness, you know, his wrath and his akos, his grief, not eros, right? But a performance of the Iliad that included Penthesilea might well have emphasized that theme. So the traditional way of ending the Iliad within the poetics that are pursued by the oral tradition that generated it, and especially in regulated contexts like the Pan-Athenaea, it may well have been the funeral of Hector. And the Pan-Hellenic Iliad may well have evolved in such a way as to, for the most part, pass over Achilles' romantic exploits, except where it concerns Briseis. But as Papyrus 104 and the Townley Scholion showed, there's really no reason why a poet who is versed in this tradition could not have segued from the Iliad to the Aethiopis as the occasion allowed or the audience requested. And then that audience would have experienced a different Iliad than the one that we know. Now, not every example of multiformity that's preserved in the papyri have these kind of dramatic narrative consequences. In fact, most of the papyri that we have, especially the early ones, they have very kind of standard forms of variation, the kind of thing that you would expect of oral derived texts. They have like one formulaic phrase in place of another. Sometimes they have more lines or fewer lines, but they're not, there's nothing shocking, right? It's not like, you know, Odysseus doesn't make it home, you know, or Achilles does sack Troy, right? That's not what happens. It's actually fairly usual forms of variation that you would find in storytelling. But interestingly, the way the Ptolemaic papyri get referred to by scholars, they get called wild and eccentric, right? They get called the wild papyri by papyrologists and editors of the Homeric poems. But really, I got to tell you guys, I've looked at a lot of them. They're not wild. They're not crazy. From the you know, from the perspective of the medieval transition, they're just not a tradition. They're just not that crazy. The variations are not surprising when you think about these poems composed within an oral tradition and being composed anew every time they're performed. So let me explore, though, another example with you that I find really interesting. And it comes from the Shield of Achilles. It's the dancing scene, right? You remember at the end about the dancing floor for Ariadne at the end of the Shield passage in Book 18 of the Iliad. Let's look at a slide of the text of 18. Yeah. So this is the passage I'm going to be talking about. The Venetis A manuscript, which is our 10th century deluxe manuscript, the oldest quote unquote complete manuscript of the Iliad that we have, and all medieval manuscripts read what I have on the slide. A great crowd stood around the lovely dancing place, delighting in it, and two tumblers throughout them, leading off the song and dance, whirled in the middle. Now, I don't know how much you know about the history of editing the Iliad, but where we get our line numbers from is from an edition made by Friedrich Wolff, or Wolff, I probably should say, he's German. And his conservative edition is the one that set the numbers for all modern editions. So he doesn't usually have line numbers that we don't consider canonical in his text. But this is one example where he does, because he included in his edition some verses that as they were attested in Athenaeus. So it's a quotation of the passage in Athenaeus, which is longer than what we find in the medieval manuscripts. And so this is the way, the second passage on the slide is the way it looks in Athenaeus. So a great crowd stood around the lovely dancing place, delighting in it, and among them a divine singer sang and played on the formings, and two tumblers throughout them, leading off the song and the dance, world in the middle. So interestingly, you might want to go to the next slide here. Modern editors don't print the Athenaeus passage because it's not attested anywhere else. And so they don't feel that that is secure enough attestation to include it. But because all of our editions use Wolff's numbering, you see they have to format it in this bizarre way, right? Where you have 604 and then 605 on the next line, left out the part in the middle that we only know from Athenaeus. I hope that's clear. Feel free to ask me any questions if it's not. But it's interesting, like what gets left out if we don't include the part that's only in Athenaeus? And if you look back, or let's go to the next slide. If you look, you see that what gets left out is the singer, right? The aoidos and the music. So we have dancing and we have song and dance, but we have no music, right? If we leave out that part. So there's a scholar named Reverman who has argued that all other passages in Homeric texts that depict dancing have music. So we should expect some music here. But he doesn't accept Athenaeus's text because it's like I say, there's no other attestation of it. He thinks it's too problematic. And actually, there are a lot of complicated arguments about the Athenaeus passage. Athenaeus actually quotes the passage twice and has a different text in the different quotations. So it is really pretty confusing stuff, I gotta say. I understand why he kind of is hesitant to embrace this one text. But there's another text that he also won't accept. He won't accept Papyrus 51. It's a 1st century BCE papyrus. And I have a slide of it if you want to look on the next slide. Yeah, there it is. And you'll see this is a very interesting papyrus. It has, for one thing, do you notice the extra verses that it has? It's got, just on this part that I've quoted, there's 5 extra verses, but this, I've only quoted a portion of the papyrus. So it's very fragmentary. So it's hard to know the full extent of what this papyrus text would have included here, but it's very clear, even on the very fragmentary column that you can only read bits of, that there were a number of extra verses on this papyrus compared to the medieval transmission of the Iliad. And one of the extra verses is 606a, right? So the first part of the passage is actually similar to what our medieval manuscripts have, right? Where there's no aoidos on there. And so we have the numbering 603 and then 604/5 for the reasons that I've explained. But yeah, so the great crowd stood around, they're delighting in it. 2 tumblers are leading off the song and the dance. And on it were panpipes and a lyre and flutes. And those aren't the only extra verse. That's not the only extra verse. You'll see there are some more further down. In addition to having the great river of Okeanos on there. Then after that, beyond what we would expect based on our medieval text of the Iliad, we have, and on it was wrought a harbor of beaten tin, and it was like as if rising from the waves, and drawing deep breaths, 2 silver dolphins reddened the scaly fish, and beneath it the bronze fish trembled. Meanwhile, on the shore, and then it keeps going, right? No editors accept these extra verses. It probably goes without saying. I'm the only one that's interested in them. No, but no modern editors print these verses in their Iliad. Stephanie West, who edited the Ptolemaic Papyri of the Iliad, in her book, she also condemns these verses. Reverman will not accept them. And one of the main reasons that they won't accept them, especially the last 4, is because they overlap with the Hesiodic text that we know as the Shield of Heracles. Now, before I get to those verses, though, let me say something about 606a. That would give us the music that is missing from the passage. There is a problem with it, though. It's not metrical. If you see, it doesn't work exactly what we need for the dactylic hexameter there. And nobody's really been able to solve that problem. So there is a metrical issue with that verse. And, I'll just leave that at that. I'm not trying to say that, this verse should be in our, printed text of the Iliad necessarily. I'm just saying that it's further evidence that maybe we should be expecting some kind of musical accompaniment here. And so it's just something to think about. Okay, so I want to turn to those other verses, 608a, b, c, and d. So like I say, one of the main reasons that editors reject these verses is that they are similar in some ways to a passage of the Hesiodic text known as the Shield of Heracles. So let's go to the next slide and look at that. Are you guys there? Oh, no, it should be. Oh, you know what, guys, sorry about that. I forgot about this wonderful slide. Let's actually look at this before we do that. This is a picture of the Papyrus 51. And if you look carefully on the last 4 lines or so of the papyrus, you can see the verses that are 608a, b, c, and d. So they are, let me see, I don't have that, yeah. It's, the one that starts with endelimen. So yeah, can you see?
There's a kappa that's very clear, which is 608b.
Yes. Right.
Beneath that is an alpha.
Exactly.
And the lines above and below those two.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can see how fragmentary the papyrus is, and how hard these texts can be to work with. But here it's not ambiguous at all that there are extra verses. And also interestingly about this papyrus is that they have critical signs next to these verses. So the critical signs are marks that the Alexandrian editors of Homer, like Aristarchus and Xenodotus, used in their editions. What they did was they put these notations in the margins next to the text, indicating that there is discussion or commentary in a separate scroll that you should go and look at and study. And the different signs have different meanings, but most of the signs on this papyrus are just a diplay, which is just a mark saying basically there's a note here. And then you would go to the separate commentary and look at it, and it would tell you, what was interesting about the verse. So it's not saying anything like this verse doesn't belong, this line is not by Homer, or whatever. It's just saying there's something interesting to talk about here. And I point this out because it indicates that this isn't just like some haphazardly written out papyrus from who knows what, right? It's a critical edition. And this particular critical edition from the 1st century CE included these verses. They may seem very unusual to us. We may not understand why you would want to keep going after the point at which the shield is complete from our perspective, but nevertheless, this text included them. Okay, so now we can go to the next slide. And here you see the Shield of Heracles passage, where I put in bold the phrases that overlap with the extra verses on the Iliad passage on papyrus. And as you can see, and I'm sorry, there's something gone wrong on this slide. I now see, if you see that, disregard that 603 at the top of the slide. I don't know how that got on there. Just disregard that. But as you can see with the quotation from the Heracles passage, we have a harbor. So we have on it a harbor with good mooring of the monstrous sea. It was wrought in a circle of pure tin, like as if rising from the waves. And in the middle of it, many dolphins started here and there fishing, like as if swimming, and drawing 2 deep breaths. 2 silver dolphins feasted on the scaly fish, and beneath them the bronze fish trembled. And meanwhile on the shore sat a fisherman watching, and he held in his hands a casting net, seeming like one about to cast it. So there's a lot of overlap in formulaic phrases between the 2 passages, but it's not at all like a direct quotation one of the other, right? It's making use of similar language. And I would say that, unlike other editors, I would say, isn't this just evidence for the system of formulaic diction in which these singers were composing? So Reverman uses the presence of these verses on the papyrus to condemn that verse 606a and all the plus verses, even though 606a contains the music that he was arguing was lacking from the medievally transmitted Shield of Achilles. And Stephanie West also speaks of the plus verses on the papyrus as being an interpolation from this Hesiodic passage that we're looking at. But if we compare the 2 passages, to my mind, like I say, it shows something pretty different, because I think both passages are making use of similar formulaic language to describe a similar image on a shield, right? That's what they're both doing. And one doesn't need to be an interpolation of the other if we take into account that both shield passages were composed within a long oral tradition of such passages. So the Iliadic Shield of Achilles and the Hesiodic Shield of Heracles are only 2 such compositions that happen to survive, but we can't know how many more existed and how prone such compositions may have been to expansion and compression and performance. So these additional verses that we find on Papyrus 51 that I showed you, I really don't think they are the work of some miscreant scribe intentionally contaminating the Iliad with verses from the Hesiodic corpus. Rather, I think that both passages are drawing on traditional formulaic language associated with shield poetry, language that was evidently readily available to poets of the Homeric and Hesiodic corpora alike. So because I and my fellow editors of the Homer multitext aren't interested in identifying a single correct or pristine text, we can appreciate Papyrus 51 in a different, I'd say more historically contextualized way. We can find evidence for the formulaic diction connected to shield poetry and the larger epic tradition. We can find evidence pointing to a thematic preference for musical accompaniment in passages that depict dancing, something that seems to have dropped out of the medievally attested text of the Shield of Achilles. And we can find evidence for how the Homeric poems were being performed and circulated and received in the 1st century BCE. The performer whose songs are the ultimate source for Papyrus 51 evidently were not always quite ready to end the making of the Shield of Achilles at verse 18, line 608. They might just keep going. And likewise, it seems plausible that the ultimate source of the multiform ending of the Iliad that's preserved on Papyrus 104 were performers who were not quite ready to end the Iliad with the burial of Hector. They too just kept going, and they brought Penthesilea onto the scene. The choice to keep going and not end with the burial of Hector, or to include an oidos singer on the shield or not, necessarily affects our understanding and reception of the Iliad, as it did for audiences in the first centuries BCE and CE. The presence of such multiformity in our earliest sources certainly complicates many traditional forms of literary analysis, but our response to that complexity doesn't have to be to hide it or dismiss it. I think rather, in embracing multiformity, we can attempt to recover some of the richness and creativity of a poetic tradition in which compositional possibilities abounded for performers, even while they worked within a highly traditional medium. What may be surprising about the papyri is that this kind of creativity persisted within the system long after the time in which scholars typically conceived of the Iliad and Odyssey as being fixed and unchanging, right? Because we're dealing with hundreds of years after this 8th century or 7th century Homer that people like to think about. Even within Greg Nage's evolutionary model for the crystallization of the text, a papyrus like Papyrus 51 comes quite late in the process. Many scholars would be comfortable with an oral tradition that remained in flux until quote unquote Homer's time, a time that's typically conceptualized as being in the late Iron Age or early Archaic period. But to embrace or even acknowledge that multiformity persisted long past this date requires abandoning modern notions of authorship and genius. It requires us to blur the line between the creative aoidos and the replicating rhapsode. Sorry, somebody's trying to call me. Sorry about that. So let me say again, it requires us to blur the line between the creative aoidos and the replicating rhapsode. And in fact, I would say it requires us to abandon Homer. So that is my presentation, but I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you. Abandoning Homer, that was a great way to end. Well, my first question is, what do you mean by that? Homer as an individual? Or
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I mean. Homer as a single figure.
Right.
I can't tell you how many manuscripts I read, how many arguments I see, published works I see, where people embrace oral tradition up until the guy they think of as Homer. But they once they get to that point, then they don't want to hear anymore.
Mm-hmm. They still need the genius there.
They still need the genius, and I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. The system kept it going, you know. There wasn't some magical end to it. And that's not to say that there were not influential figures within the tradition, but I think that to really, if you really look at the evidence, really that's what this book that I wrote is all about, Achilles Unbound. If you look at the evidence without prejudice, you find that it was a multiform tradition. There was not a fixed text until very, very late in the process. And even then, there wasn't a fixed text, right? Even the medieval tradition is not uniform. It's mostly uniform, but not completely. If you want to talk in terms of like conventional text criticism, you can divide the surviving medieval manuscripts into about 25 manuscript families. That's the best you can do. You can get back to 25 channels of transmission.
Wow, that's not a fixed text.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, those variations are not shocking in any way, right? We would consider them. I don't want to call them minor. I hate that. People very frequently refer to these kinds of variations that survive in the medieval transition and even in the papyri as banal or not worth consideration. As just, you know, I don't even know how they conceive of them, honestly. But I think they're very interesting, but they're not like some shocking deviation, because we're dealing with a tradition, right? Like the singers are not trying to do something new and different, right? They are the tradition, and they are fully it, and composing in it, and keeping it going. And so they're not trying to do anything new. But in fact, since the poems are composed new every time, the result is that our textual transmission is still reflective of that multiformity.
Mm-hmm. I recently read, on a completely other topic, that even after the advent of printing, early books were not identical. And I didn't read about the reasons for that yet. I haven't tracked that down, but yeah, it goes, much later than one expects. But that's me time for questions. Maria, I see you have a question.
Yes. Casey, thank you very much for this excellent, as always, presentation. I'm really interested in these lines, in these 4 lines that you mentioned, that Stephanie West and Reverman, if I'm not mistaken, think that they do not belong due to metrical reasons, and because they overlap with Hesiod's space. Is this correct?
The 4 extra lines that they don't reject those for metrical reasons. They reject them because they overlap with the shield passage. And they don't perfectly overlap, as we saw, right? They're making use of formulaic language. But they say they're not attested elsewhere, right? They're not attested elsewhere. And then they overlap in some ways with the Hesiodic passage. And so those 4 verses, they just categorically condemn for those reasons. Like I say, mainly because they don't have any other attestation in another like medieval manuscript or another papyrus.
Okay, so I'm really interested in following your argument. So in a way, do you, I mean, since you're really interested in editing the Homeric text, how are you going, I mean, to tackle this thing with these 4 verses? Do you think that they are part of the Iliad? Are you going to dismiss them as well? Since, as you as you well put it, we have the papyrus 51, or there was another papyrus that it attests this these 4 verses. This is what I would like to know more about it. It's more like I would like I would like you to tell us more about how are you going to, if not edit, also at least handle these 4 verses.
I will tell you.
I will just mute myself because I'm unable to hear you very.
Yes. So. That's a great question, and I actually, for once, have an answer. What we do with the Homer multi-text is we're not creating a single text. What we're doing is publishing as many historical instantiations of the text as we can. So we're publishing the Venetus A exactly as it is. We've edited it to match exactly what's in the document. We're going to do the same. We've already done the same with papyri. They're not as easily accessible within our system yet, but we've done, for a number of papyri, especially for book 10, we have a number of edited papyri where we just represent exactly what's on the papyrus. So when you're working with the text in the Homer multi-text, you can, there's various kinds of searching and analysis you can do, or you can, get our data from GitHub and make some, cool, tool yourself. But basically you'll have all these historical instantiations of the text, and they're just there for you to work with and to see. So any kind of search or analysis you do, they'll appear for you. And so you will know that these exist, right? Whereas most editors make it very hard for you to even know that they exist. Certainly you have to be very specialized to understand how an apparatus criticus works and to know the Latin abbreviations and to know the ways that these things are referred to. I think we're kind of democratizing it in a way by opening it up and just, like I say, publishing as many historical instantiations of the text as we can on their own terms, so that you can see, hey, this papyrus from the 1st century BC has these verses.
Because as you rightly mentioned, this papyrus is, after all, a critical edition. I think you mentioned this in your talk, huh?
It is. It has critical signs. And what's interesting, and I don't mean to, I mean, you know, I have enormous respect for Stephanie West, so I'm not trying to call out this one particular scholar, but what I want to say is that she finds the critical signs, she calls them something like the most problematic feature of this papyrus. And the reason why it's problematic for her is because she wants to call this papyrus some, you know, eccentric aberration. She wants it to be some, you know, crazy person made this text, or some illiterate person made this text, or whatever. And so she doesn't like that there are indications a critical edition, that this was a carefully made edition that included these verses. So they're problematic for her because they don't fit her conception of what this text is. And what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the ancient papyri, especially the ones that predate 150 BC, this is the norm. It is normal for them to have extra verses or fewer verses or whole lines in place of other lines or different kinds of formulaic variation. That's usual. It's not wild, it's the norm. And so we have to grapple with that.
So even the overlaps with the Hesiotic text, if I understood you correctly, you may be able to use them towards your argument of the multiformity of the Homeric text. Am I right, or have I got it wrong?
No, that's right. That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm trying to say that in antiquity, the Iliad and Odyssey was performed with considerable more variation and multiformity than we normally accept. We like to think that the Iliad that we know is the one that ancient audiences knew. And I'm saying that ancient audiences knew a much more multiform tradition than we do. So whether you think those verses were composed by the genius Homer or not, the reality is that how the Iliad was known and experienced in antiquity was far more fluid than our editions lead us to believe.